Hey, welcome to a new week, everyone, and welcome to our first reading class for our last book of the year. It's crazy to think that we're only a handful of school days left, about, I think, 13, 14, something like that, school days left before the end of the year. And we've made it now to our last novel of the year. Think of all the different novels and vocab words that we've read and learned over this time period of this full school year. So I'm excited to read this book. I think you're going to enjoy this one. It's a quick one that we'll have done even before the end of May here. And I think it teaches us a lot. It's got some really powerful themes in it. I want you to be patient with it. If I remember right, it might start a little slow. But as the book goes on, I think you're going to really learn to enjoy it. So Maniac, Magee by Jerry Spinelli is what we're going to start looking at today. I want you to pretend like you're walking down this street, we'll say maybe in downtown Minneapolis. It's getting later at night, and you're heading home, walking towards your house with a friend, and all of a sudden someone pops out of one of the alleys that you walk by and demands that you hand over to them the wallet that you have in your pocket or in your purse. And I want you to really picture that person and how scary that they look and how you would be feeling in that moment, right? Really terrified and scared. But I want you just to imagine that situation and picture that person that's trying to take your money. Got a good picture of that situation in your mind and what that person looks like? Now I want you to take a look at these two pictures. Which person, the person on the left or the person on the right, did that person in your situation look like? If you're being honest, you probably pictured someone that looked more like this, someone who is an African American. Now, if that's true, now it may not be true for all of you, but this experiment that I just did on you guys was done on hundreds of white people, and way more than half of those white people pictured an African American person trying to steal their money. Interesting, right? Well, the reason for that is there's a fancy word. It's called stereotyping. Stereotyping, we'll talk about the meaning of that word, but we tend to make generalizations, or we tend to think things about certain cultures, sometimes that are very bad, like in this situation, that we think of criminals as being African American people instead of white people. And that would be an example of stereotyping. So let's talk about that a little bit. Here's what a stereotype is. It's thinking that all or most of the members of a certain group of people are a certain way. For instance, all blacks are more likely to be criminals, or all blacks are good athletes, or all blacks are not very smart. Those would be really bad stereotypes. In fact, all stereotypes we're going to talk about are really not a good thing. Or here would be another one. We don't just have to use African Americans. We could use men. All men are stronger than women. Now, maybe that's true a lot of the time, but there are some pretty strong women out there, too. I've seen weightlifting in the Olympics for women. I wouldn't want to mess with any of those ladies. I think they're pretty strong, right? Or all women are better cooks than men. You know, I've heard people say stuff like that, and that's not true either. I know a lot of good women cooks, and I know a lot of good men cooks. Those are stereotypes, and stereotypes can be very harmful. And because we're all sinful human beings, sometimes we have thoughts about people of other cultures or races, or maybe someone who's a different gender than us. We sometimes assume things to be true that aren't really true for everybody. And that can be a harmful thing. Like, for instance, many white people thinking if someone's a criminal, it must be a black person, right? That's a very wrong and harmful stereotype, and yet you probably have to admit in that first situation that I gave you, you maybe thought of an African-American person who was committing that crime. Our own brains, because they're sinful, tend to not trust people of other cultures and have bad thoughts sometimes of other cultures. That's the sinfulness of our world today. So there are two types of stereotypes. There are negative stereotypes and positive stereotypes. Now, even though one type is called positive, I want you to see why all stereotypes are actually bad things or can lead to bad things. Here are some examples of negative stereotypes. Black people are more likely to be criminals. We talked about that one already, right? Or black people aren't as smart as white people. I think that started really back in the time of slavery, and it still exists today. I think there are people out there. If I said picture a really smart person reading a book, or a really smart scientist in a lab coat, do you ever picture an African American in a lab wearing a lab coat doing really smart science experiments? Probably not, right? You probably tend to picture like a white guy in a suit coat, in a lab coat in a lab somewhere, right? That's something that I think we're all guilty of. Black people are poor. You know, sometimes we have thoughts like that. Like we think of a poor inner city area and we think of a black person right away, right? Although there are many people who are poor who are white too, right? Or black people aren't trustworthy. Those are all negative stereotypes, very hurtful things. And it's hurtful to think about that with every black person, right? Certainly there are black criminals, but there are white criminals too. Certainly there are black people maybe who aren't the smartest, but there are white people that aren't the smartest either, right? Certainly there are black people that are poor, but you can find white people that are poor too. And so those stereotypes you can see are harmful. There can even be positive stereotypes, stereotypes that seem to sound like they're better, but even these can be harmful. Okay, examples of positive stereotypes, take a look at that first one. All blacks are great basketball players. You ever think that yourself? Or all blacks are good wide receivers or running backs in football, right? We tend to have thoughts like that. Now, that might be true for a lot of them, but are all of them that way? Or all Asian people are geniuses? You know, we think of, if I said picture a spelling bee winner or a math counts winner, and maybe you thought of an Asian person, right? Or all whites are successful. You know, that sounds positive, but again, that's a stereotype that's not true for everyone, right? Or all Asians know kung fu or taekwondo or something like that, right? Those are stereotypes. Those are thinking something that is true about everybody of a certain race or culture, when certainly that's not always the case. And so stereotypes I want you to see today, this is one of the themes of the book. Judging someone based on a stereotype or assuming that all people of a certain race or a certain culture are the same, those are harmful because it causes you to think thoughts about a person that probably are not even true, or it causes you to judge someone before you ever get a chance to meet them. Just an example of that. When I was at one of my last schools, I think I've told this story before, there was this really big, muscular, strong guy. He was really tall too. When I looked at him, I had to look like almost up to the ceiling. And I'm a shorter guy, so it was kind of imposing for me to have to stare up at him. You know, in my mind, I think I had this stereotype that all big, really tall, muscular guys, you know, don't really care so much about school or learning and things like that. They're more interested in sports or wrestling and things like that, right? And then this guy was actually picked by our church to be the education board leader. In other words, the person who helps lead the school. And when that person was chosen, I remember being like, oh man, that's not going to be a good person for the job. I can't imagine talking school with him. Because in my mind, I was making a stereotype that big muscular dudes don't care that much about school. I was like, what is he going to add to the school? And then I got to know him. And he was at the first meeting after that vote. And he was one of the nicest, gentlest, most friendly men I'd ever met. And he loved school and cared a lot about school and had a lot of great ideas. And so you can see why stereotypes are harmful. I was kind of afraid of this guy and thinking, oh, he's not going to do a very good job. I have to admit that. And I judged him before I even got to know him. And I'm glad I was able to get that cleared up in my head. And if you're being honest, your brain does stereotyping too. You think things are true about some certain types of people before you ever get to know them. And so one of the themes of this book is to avoid stereotyping. Stereotyping can be a very harmful thing. To assume that something is true about, for instance, all African Americans, or to assume that something is true about all different types of people can be a very harmful thing that we want to be careful to avoid. Here's one reason why stereotypes are harmful. They did a study once. They wrote resumes. Resumes are sheets of paper you submit to a business if you want to get a job there. And they made many of the resumes, it was all the same person, but they made many of the resumes sound like a black person. The spot where they said they lived was a typical place where black people live, and the name they made sound like an African-American name. And then they made a whole bunch of resumes, again, all for the same person. All the qualifications were the same and the things that they were good at were the same, but all they changed were the names or where they lived. And they made a whole bunch of resumes, job applications that sounded like a white person, white people names, right? And white people places where typical white people live. And guess who got called way more often? The white people. The white people got way more calls than those who were, they made the resume to sound like a black person. Again, this is the idea without us even thinking sometimes that we tend to trust or think certain things about a certain cultural group more than we do of other cultural groups. It's something because of sin we all struggle with. And there's an example of stereotyping really hurting someone. Just because someone's African American, people seem to, even without thinking about it, assume that they wouldn't be as good for the job. So stereotypes are very harmful, and that's going to be a theme that this book really talks about. We're going to see some characters who struggle with stereotyping, thinking things about someone of a different culture without really getting to know them. I have to admit that I grew up from the time I was a baby till the time I was in college. I was around very few people of different cultures. Most of my schools were all white schools, kind of like ours at St. Peter Lutheran. Almost all the kids were white kids. In high school, I think maybe there was one African-American boy in my whole high school because I went to a small little Wisconsin high school. And in college even, there weren't very many African-Americans or people of other cultures there. And so I have to admit, I had some ideas about people, especially of different cultures, that maybe weren't true. And I didn't really know much about them. And I had never learned much about the African-American culture or people of other cultures until I got a call to teach school in Florida. And in Florida, a lot of my kids were African American kids or kids that were Hispanic from like Mexico or other South American countries. And I got to learn a lot about that culture, and I realized a lot of the things that were in my head about that culture were not true. Some of the nicest people I've ever met and worked with were some of these African American families and their kids, and certainly not all of them were good at basketball. Like we have this idea in our head that all African Americans love basketball. No, some of them loved math, and some of them loved to read books. And that was a good experience for me to really be around people of different cultures. This is a picture of one of my classes from Florida. And you can see how many of those different kids were from different cultures. That was good for me because it broke down a lot of the stereotypes I had in my mind. And that's good for us to do, to break those down and not assume that everyone of a certain culture is a certain way. That was a good experience for me, and I hope you guys get experiences like that working with people of different cultures in your future too, because that's a really neat thing. And so in our book, we're going to see a white boy. Maniac Magee is his nickname. That's the name of our book, too. Come into contact, probably for one of the first times in his life, with some African-American kids and families. And we're going to see how he reacts to that and maybe some of the ideas that he has in his head that are stereotypes, assumptions of people of a different culture, and that those African-Americans that he meets have different assumptions and ideas about him and the way he should be because he's white. And we're going to see how that plays into our story. The other theme that we're going to think a lot about is what it's like to be an orphan. An orphan is someone who doesn't have parents, and how hard it would be to be an orphan. You know, all of you either have parents or adopted parents and are blessed to have that, but there are many, many kids in our world today that don't have any parents at all, not even adoptive parents, and how difficult life must be for them. You ever stop and think about that, how blessed you are to either have parents or adoptive parents? Being an orphan is really hard, and we're going to see how Maniac Magee in our book doesn't have any parents, and how hard and difficult his life is because of that. Here's a poem written by an orphan. I want to read that to you because I think it gets you to think about some of the things that an orphan would miss out on because they don't have any parents. Here's what it says. Being an orphan. I have been alone for a long time, an orphan. Nobody was with me, no parents to turn to. I waited for a long time expecting someone who might love me as their kid. No one came to call me when I cried. I still hoped, but at last I gave up. I realized I was alone in the world. Does anybody care about me? Every day when I see classmates at school, I often dream about going home with them. I wonder what it's like to be part of a family. They take it for granted to go home to a mom and a dad. Whenever someone mentions parents or asks me about my mom and dad, I have nothing to answer. No fun stories to tell. I hang my head and keep to myself. Since I am an orphan and no one loves me, oh God, at least in my next life, please provide me with parents who love me. I don't want to be alone anymore in this life. So that was written by an orphan. And maybe that kind of tugs at your heartstrings a little bit as you realize maybe some of the things you do take for granted that you have loving parents who care about you. There are kids who, when they hear about parents, they get sad because they don't have any. So we'll see how that affects our character in our book today too, Maniac Magee. Then a few quick explanations of some things you're going to come across in this book, okay? You're going to hear about butterscotch crimpets. They're like packaged little cupcake type things or little cakes. So you'll hear about those. I just want you to know what those are. Butterscotch crimpets. You're going to hear about Zeps. Zeps is a fancy name for subs, okay, or hoagies or whatever you call them at your house. Big, long sandwiches, right? And so that's what a Zep is. You'll hear about those from time to time in our book. And then they're going to have the sport of baseball in our book. So if you're a baseball fan, this might be a book you really enjoy because of that. Even if you're not, I think you're going to like this book. But especially if you're a baseball fan, maybe this book will draw you in. I want to talk about some baseball terms. A scout is someone who goes to high schools and colleges and watches players play to try to find what the best players are so that they can get them on their team in the major leagues. Okay, so the minor leagues are like lesser baseball teams that players play on to get better before they're allowed to play like in those big stadiums in the major leagues, right? So every big team that plays in those big stadiums like the Minnesota Twins have minor league teams of players that are training to become better that hopefully someday will make it to the Twins team, okay? The game of pepper is a baseball game you play to get better. You throw the ball towards someone and they bunt it. They do a little tiny hit back to you. And then you pick up the ball and you throw it to them again and they bunt it back to you. So it's a practice game. You can practice bunting and fielding. Fungos are big flat bats that coaches will sometimes use to hit grounders to players. They're a lot wider than a normal bat like this so that it's easy to hit a little grounder to someone so that they can practice fielding grounders. A rookie is a first-year baseball player playing for the first time in the major leagues, okay? And a pitcher is someone who throws the ball towards the batter so that they can hit it, okay? So those are all baseball terms. I know most of you probably knew all those already, but in order for this book to make sense, you'll need to know some of those terms at a few spots in the book, okay? I want to read the introduction to the book on pages 1 and 2, then we'll jump on to page 5 and read the actual part of the book. So join with me on page 1 and 2. Before the story, they say Maniac Magee was born in a dump. They say his stomach was a cereal box and his heart a sofa spring. They say he kept an 8-inch cockroach on a leash and the rats stood guard over him while he slept. They say if you knew he was coming and you sprinkled salt on the ground and he ran over it, within 2 or 3 blocks he would be as slow as everybody else. They say. What's true? What's myth? It's hard to know. Finsterwald's gone now, yet even today you'll never find a kid sitting on the steps where he once lived. The Little League field is still there and the band shell. Cobble's Corner still stands at the corner of Hector and Birch. Those are street names. And if you ask the man behind the counter, he'll take the clump of string out of a drawer and let you see it. Grade school girls in 2 Mills, that's the city where our book takes place, still jump rope and chant, Maniac, Maniac, he's so cool. Maniac, Maniac, don't go to school. Runs all night, runs all right. Maniac, Maniac, kissed a bull. You'll see what that means more as the book goes on. And sometimes the girl holding one end of the rope is from the west side of Hector, and the girl on the other end is from the east side. And if you're looking for Maniac Magee's legacy, by the way, is one of our first vocab words, or monument, that's as good as any, even if it wasn't really a bull. But that's okay, because the history of a kid is 1 part fact, 2 parts legend, and 3 parts snowball. And if you want to know what it was like back when Maniac Magee roamed these parts, well, just run your hand under your movie seat and be very, very careful not to let the facts get mixed up with the truth. So as you can see, this book is going to be a legend about a boy named Maniac Magee who lived in a city called 2 Mills years before this story is being told. And as in any legend, which by the way is our secret code word for today, legend, okay? That'll be our secret code word. In any legend, you'll see that facts get stretched, right? Maybe you've heard legends of like Babe Ruth, the baseball player. He was a good home run hitter, but there's legends of him hitting like 800-foot home runs. No way. That's a legend. Or, maybe a legend of a fish that someone in your family caught. And the first time they caught the fish was a foot long. And then, next time you tell the story, it was 1.5 feet long. And then the next time you tell the story, it was a 5-foot long fish, right? Legends are stories that kind of get stretched. And you'll see that's kind of the humor of this book, is it's a legend. And there's some humorous spots where characters seem to exaggerate and stretch the story. So you'll enjoy that. So we'll pick up on page 5 then next. All right, our books should have matching pages this time around, even if you have different covers than the one that's being shown there. I checked, and I'm pretty sure, let me know if I'm wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure all of our books have the same page numbers, even with the different covers this time. That'll be a lot easier. So we're going to read just a few pages together to get you going in this book. I know I have pages 1 to 7 on the top there, but our book, if you page through the first few pages, they're counting the page numbers of like the title page and stuff. So it actually, in my book at least, doesn't start till page 5 in chapter 1. So here we go. We're going to learn a little bit about Maniac Magee, some things about his background, and we're going to learn about, how the fact that he's an orphan and such, and we're going to look at what his life is like on pages 5, 6, and 7. Here we go. Maniac Magee was not born in a dump. He was born in a house, a pretty ordinary house, right across the river from here in Bridgeport. And he had regular parents, a mother and a father, but not for long. One day his parents left him with a sitter and took the P&W high-speed trolley into the city. On the way back home, they were on board when the P&W had its famous crash, when the motorman was drunk and took the high trestle over the Schuylkill River at 60 miles an hour, and the whole caboodle took a swan dive into the water. So his parents died in a trolley accident. Trolleys are like little buses that go around in certain parts of our country, like San Francisco. Okay, so his parents were killed in an accident. And just like that, Maniac was an orphan. He was only 3 years old. Of course, to be accurate, he wasn't really Maniac then. He was Jeffrey Lionel Magee. So that's his real name. Bottom of 5. Little Jeffrey was shipped off to his nearest relatives, Aunt Dot and Uncle Dan. They lived in Hollidaysburg in western part of Pennsylvania. Top of 6. Aunt Dot and Uncle Dan hated each other, but because they were strict Catholics, they wouldn't get a divorce. Around the time Jeffrey arrived, they stopped talking to each other. Then they stopped sharing. So he just got passed to his aunt and uncle. And unfortunately, his aunt and uncle were not nice people, constantly fighting, couldn't even get along, even though they were married. And so that was kind of a tough situation to get passed into, right? Pretty soon, there were 2 of everything in the house. 2 bathrooms, 2 TVs, 2 refrigerators, 2 toasters. If it were possible, they would have had 2 Jeffreys. And as it was, they split him up as best they could. For instance, he would eat dinner with Aunt Dot on Monday, with Uncle Dan on Tuesday, and so on. So they couldn't share anything, so they all got their own separate things, right? 8 years of that. Then came the night of the spring musical at Jeffrey's school. He was in the chorus. There was only one show in one auditorium, so Aunt Dot and Uncle Dan were forced to share at least that much. Aunt Dot sat on one side, Uncle Dan on the other. Jeffrey probably started screaming from the start of the song, which was, "Talk to the animals," but nobody knew it because he was drowned out by all the other voices. Then the music ended, and Jeffrey went right on screaming, his face bright red now, his neck bulging. The music director faced the singers, frozen with his arms still raised. In the audience, faces began to change. There was a quick smatter of giggling by some people who figured the screaming kid was some part of the show, some funny animal maybe. Then the giggling stopped, and eyes started to shift and heads started to turn because now everybody could see that this wasn't part of the show at all, that little Jeffrey Magee wasn't supposed to be up there on the risers, pointing to his aunt and uncle, bellowing out from the midst of the chorus, "Talk! Talk, will ya? Talk! Talk! Talk!" So notice he got so sick of his aunt and uncle not talking and fighting, he just lost it in the middle of this class play that he was supposed to be putting on. He started shouting at them to talk. He just lost his mind. He was so upset, right? No one knew it then, but it was the birth scream of a legend. And that's when the running started. 3 springy steps down from the risers, girls in pastel dresses screaming, the music director lunging, a leap from the stage, out the side door and into the starry, sweet onion grass-smelling night, never again to return to the house of 2 toasters, never again to return to school. So Maniac Magee, like you see in the cover picture there, just decides he's had enough. He just takes off running out of the school play and out of the building and never to come back again. So we'll see what happens because of that. That's where you'll pick up your reading for today. Enjoy the book, everyone.